Scott Bessent straightened his $12,000 Italian suit as he strode into courtroom 714. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor, his presence commanding the space like he commanded his $8.5 billion hedge fund. The gallery quieted as he entered, some in awe, others in disgust, but nobody with indifference. After all, you don't become Wall Street's Teflon Titan without collecting both admirers and enemies. His attorney, James Worthington III of Worthington and Pierce, walked beside him, whispering reassurances. "This is a formality, Scott. Judge Wallace is tough but fair. The prosecution has nothing substantial." Bessent nodded slightly, but his eyes remained fixed forward. He didn't need reassurance. In his 30-year career navigating financial labyrinths, he'd never once been successfully prosecuted. Money talked, and his money had the loudest voice in any room, including this courtroom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thank you in advance. But Judge Catherine Wallace wasn't listening to money today. As Bessent took his seat at the defense table, she entered from her chambers. Unlike most who encountered the billionaire, she didn't glance his way. Instead, she methodically arranged her papers, adjusted her glasses, and then surveyed the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. "The United States versus Scott Bessent," she announced, her voice carrying a quiet authority more commanding than any shout. "Case number 23, CR 7614, charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion totaling over $340 million. Bessent leaned back slightly, a barely perceptible smile playing at his lips. He'd faced similar charges before. They always disappeared, like morning fog under the heat of his legal team's motions to dismiss. "Mr. Bessent," Judge Wallace addressed him directly, her gaze finally meeting his. "I understand your attorney has filed a motion to dismiss all charges." Worthington stood quickly. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe the government's case lacks merit and—" "I've read your motion, Counselor," she interrupted, her tone unchanged. "It's denied." The gallery stirred. Bessent's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch, the equivalent of shocked outrage for a man who prided himself on emotional discipline. "Your Honor," Worthington began again, "with all due respect—" "With all due respect, Counselor," Judge Wallace countered, "your client's pattern of legal maneuvering ends today. This court will hear the evidence." A muscle in Bessent's jaw twitched. He leaned forward and whispered something to Worthington, who nodded and stood again. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to consider our options given this unexpected ruling." Judge Wallace removed her glasses, folding them deliberately. "Mr. Worthington, we haven't even begun. The prosecution hasn't presented a single piece of evidence. What options could you possibly need to consider at this juncture?" Bessent's confident facade cracked slightly. He wasn't accustomed to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone whose annual salary amounted to what he spent on private jet fuel in a month. "Your Honor," he said, standing without his attorney's prompt, "perhaps I could address the court directly?" The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is represented by counsel." Wallace held up a hand. "I'll allow it." Her eyes fixed on Bessent. "Proceed, Mr. Bessent. I'm curious to hear what you have to say." Bessent buttoned his jacket and stepped forward, assuming the easy confidence of a man accustomed to boardrooms and CNBC interviews. "Judge Wallace, I understand the theater of these proceedings. The government needs its occasional high-profile target to demonstrate vigilance. I accept that role." He smiled magnanimously. "But we both know these charges are politically motivated and technically flimsy. I've built a career creating wealth and jobs. My financial strategies are aggressive but legal." The courtroom was silent now, all eyes ping-ponging between the billionaire and the judge. Bessent continued, his voice smooth as polished granite. "Your time is valuable, so is mine. Rather than waste weeks on trial, I propose a reasonable settlement. A fine, perhaps, and we can all return to more productive endeavors." Judge Wallace didn't respond immediately. She studied Bessent as one might examine a curious specimen under glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the room. "Mr. Bessent, in my 26 years on the federal bench, I've heard variations of that speech countless times. usually from men in expensive suits who believe their wealth places them in a separate legal category. She leaned forward slightly. Let me be abundantly clear. In this courtroom, your net worth buys you nothing. Not preferential treatment, not leniency, and certainly not my agreement to short-circuit justice. Bessent's confident expression faltered, then hardened. Your Honor, with respect, You've had your say, Mr. Bessent. Please, sit down. He remained standing. I don't think you understand who I am. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Wallace's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Mr. Bessent, I understand exactly who you are. The question is whether you understand where you are. She glanced at the bailiff. Please ensure Mr. Bessent is seated. Bessent felt the bailiff approach but waved him off, returning to his seat with a scowl. This wasn't proceeding according to plan. Typically by now, judges were finding procedural reasons to limit evidence or grant continuances that stretch cases into oblivion. Judge Wallace turned to the prosecution. Ms. Chen, call your first witness. Chen stood. The United States calls Michael Reynolds. A door opened, and a man in his early 50s entered. Bessent straightened suddenly, his face flushing. Reynolds, his former CFO, the man he'd personally fired 6 months ago, supposedly for incompetence. Worthington gripped Bessent's arm. Stay calm, he whispered. We knew this was coming. But Bessent's eyes betrayed him. They knew nothing of the sort. Reynolds was sworn in, his voice steady as he stated his name and former position. Chen approached him with practiced ease. Mr. Reynolds, how long did you work for Mr. Bessent? 7 years. I joined Bessent Capital in 2017 as controller and was promoted to CFO in 2019. And during that time, did Mr. Bessent ever instruct you to perform accounting practices you considered questionable? Worthington shot to his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation and a legal conclusion. Sustained, Judge Wallace nodded. Rephrase, Ms. Chen. Chen smiled slightly. Mr. Reynolds, did Mr. Bessent ever give you specific instructions regarding how certain transactions should be recorded? Reynolds nodded, glancing briefly at Bessent. Yes. Beginning in 2020, Mr. Bessent established what he called alternative accounting protocols. These were specific instructions for how certain high-value transactions should be logged in our systems. Can you elaborate on these protocols? Reynolds reached for the water glass beside him. They involve creating multiple shell companies in various tax jurisdictions: Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Singapore. Large transactions would be broken into smaller pieces, run through these entities, and then reconsolidated later. And what was the purpose of this elaborate structure? Mr. Bessent explained it as tax optimization, but the effect was to obscure the true nature of the transactions from regulators and tax authorities. Bessent leaned forward, whispering furiously to Worthington, who nodded and stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Reynolds is not a tax expert. His characterization of legitimate tax planning as something nefarious is prejudicial. Judge Wallace considered. I'll allow it, but the jury will note that the witness is sharing his understanding, not making legal determinations. Chen continued. Mr. Reynolds, did Mr. Bessent ever directly acknowledge that these strategies might cross legal boundaries? Reynolds paused, then reached into his jacket pocket. He did more than acknowledge it. He documented it. He pulled out a folded paper and handed it to Chen, who looked momentarily surprised. Your Honor, Chen said, the prosecution requests to enter this new document into evidence. Worthington was on his feet instantly. Objection. This wasn't included in discovery. We've had no opportunity to review this mysterious document. Judge Wallace frowned. Ms. Chen? Your Honor, we're equally surprised. This appears to be new evidence the witness has independently brought forward. Approach the bench, Wallace ordered. As the attorneys moved forward, Bessent stared at Reynolds, his face a mask of controlled fury. Reynolds met his gaze steadily, without flinching. At the bench, Worthington was practically vibrating with indignation. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Whatever that document is, it cannot be admitted without proper discovery. Judge Wallace examined the paper. This appears to be a handwritten note on Bessent Capital letterhead. She looked at Chen. Did you know about this? No, Your Honor. The witness never mentioned it during our preparation. Wallace turned to the witness. Mr. Reynolds, why are you presenting this now rather than giving it to the prosecution earlier? Reynolds spoke clearly. Because it was in a safety deposit box with instructions to retrieve it only if Mr. Bessent contested these charges in court. I was concerned about my personal safety if this document became known before absolutely necessary. Judge Wallace studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll allow it, but the defense will have ample time to review before cross-examination. We'll take a 30-minute recess. As the judge left the bench, Bessent grabbed Worthington's arm. What the hell is that document? Worthington looked grim. I don't know yet, but Reynolds looks too confident for it to be nothing. Bessent's composure was cracking. Get it thrown out. That's what I pay you for. Scott, listen to me. Worthington lowered his voice. If that's what I think it is, a direct instruction from you to circumvent tax law, we need to consider a plea deal immediately. No deals, Bessent hissed. Reynolds is trying to save his own skin. It's his word against mine. Not if you put it in writing, Worthington muttered, moving to examine the document. When court resumed, the tension had thickened to something almost tangible. Judge Wallace adjusted her robe and nodded to Chen. The document is admitted as Prosecution Exhibit 42. You may continue, Ms. Chen. Chen took the paper, now encased in a clear evidence sleeve, and returned to Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds, can you tell the court what this document is? Reynolds leaned toward the microphone. It's a handwritten note from Scott Bessent to me, dated April 17, 2021. It outlines how to handle the Artemis transaction, a $127 million deal that was particularly creative in its structure. Would you read the highlighted portion? Reynolds nodded. It says, Mike, use the Singapore route for this one. Standard reporting would trigger IRS flags we don't need. If anyone asks, we stick to the story that these are independent transactions, worth the risk given the tax savings. SB Prime. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Bessent's face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. Chen let the words hang in the air before continuing. Mr. Reynolds, based on your financial expertise and years of experience, what does worth the risk refer to in this context? Objection, Worthington called. Calls for speculation. Overruled, Judge Wallace said firmly. The witness worked closely with the defendant and can speak to his understanding of communications between them. Reynolds straightened his tie. In our previous conversations, the risk always referred to the risk of regulatory detection and potential penalties. Mr. Bessent frequently conducted what he called risk-reward calculations on our tax strategies. Chen nodded. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. She turned to the judge. No further questions at this time. Judge Wallace turned to the defense. Cross-examination, Mr. Worthington? Worthington stood, buttoning his jacket. Yes, Your Honor. He approached Reynolds with the confident stride of a man who'd demolished countless witnesses. Mr. Reynolds, isn't it true that you were fired from Bessent Capital for incompetence? Reynolds didn't flinch. That was the official reason given. And isn't it also true that you threatened to make Bessent pay after your termination? Several colleagues heard this threat. I was upset after being fired. I may have said something in the heat of the moment. Worthington paced before the witness stand. So you admit you have a vendetta against Mr. Bessent. Doesn't that color your testimony today? No more than Mr. Bessent's desire to stay out of prison colors his version of events. A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. Judge Wallace tapped her gavel once. Worthington's eyes narrowed. Let's discuss this convenient note you've produced. You expect us to believe you kept it in a safety deposit box for 3 years, never mentioning it to investigators until today? Yes, Reynolds answered simply, because I knew what Scott Bessent would do to protect himself. And what exactly is that, Mr. Reynolds? Whatever it takes, including making people who cross him disappear professionally. Worthington scoffed. Sounds rather dramatic. Do you have evidence of these alleged retaliations? Eric Daniels, former head of risk management, questioned a similar transaction in 2019. He was fired within a week, then blacklisted across the industry. Maria Vasquez from compliance raised concerns about the Luxembourg structure. She was transferred to an office in Alaska. There are dozens more examples. Bessent was writing furiously on a legal pad, pushing notes to Worthington, who ignored them. Mr. Reynolds, this note could easily have been fabricated. Isn't it convenient that it appears just when you need something to substantiate your claims? Reynolds leaned forward. The ink can be tested, and I believe Mr. Bessent's handwriting is quite distinctive. But there's something else. A hush fell over the courtroom. What else? Worthington asked, suddenly wary. Mr. Bessent didn't just write notes. Reynolds reached into his suit jacket again. He recorded conversations. The courtroom erupted. Bessent half rose from his chair, his face contorted. Worthington looked stricken. Order! Judge Wallace struck her gavel repeatedly. Order in the court! When the room quieted, she fixed Reynolds with a stern gaze. Mr. Reynolds, are you testifying that you have recordings of Mr. Bessent? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bessent recorded all significant meetings as a matter of policy. His personal insurance, he called it. When I was terminated, I took copies of recordings where he explicitly directed illegal activity. Judge Wallace turned to Chen. Prosecution, were you aware of these recordings? Chen looked as shocked as everyone else. No, Your Honor. This is the first we're hearing of this. Bessent was on his feet now. This is absurd. He's lying. Those recordings are company property, if they even exist. Judge Wallace banged her gavel. Mr. Bessent, sit down immediately. Bessent remained standing, his composure completely evaporated. This is a setup. Reynolds is trying to extort me through this farce of a trial. Mr. Bessent, Judge Wallace's voice cut like steel. This is your final warning. Sit down or I will have you removed. Do you know who I am? Bessent's voice rose. I could buy this entire courthouse. You're nothing but a civil servant with delusions of grandeur. The courtroom froze in shocked silence. Even Worthington had backed away from his client. Judge Wallace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Bessent, you are in contempt of court. She nodded to the bailiff. Take him into custody. What? Bessent's eyes widened as the bailiff approached. This is ridiculous. You can't do this. He turned to Worthington. Do something. Worthington shook his head slightly, powerless. As the bailiff reached for his arm, Bessent jerked away. Don't touch me. Do you know how many judges I've had replaced? With one phone call, I can end your career, Wallace. Two more court officers moved forward now. Judge Wallace watched impassively as Bessent continued to resist, his $12,000 suit wrinkling in the officer's grip. Your Honor, Worthington tried desperately, my client is under tremendous stress. If we could have a brief recess. Your client has demonstrated exactly who he is, Mr. Worthington, Judge Wallace replied, and it appears Mr. Reynolds' characterization was accurate. As the officers secured handcuffs around Bessent's wrists, the reality of his situation finally seemed to dawn on him. His struggles ceased, replaced by stunned disbelief. Additionally, Judge Wallace continued, given Mr. Bessent's threats and the new evidence presented, I am revoking bail pending the conclusion of this trial. Bessent stared at her, the color draining from his face. You can't put me in jail. I'm Scott Bessent. Judge Wallace met his gaze unflinchingly. In this courtroom, Mr. Bessent, you are simply defendant number 23, C R7614. As the officers led him toward the side door, Bessent's carefully constructed world was visibly crumbling. His eyes darted around the courtroom, at the journalists scribbling notes, at Reynolds watching calmly from the witness stand, at the jurors whose faces reflected not sympathy, but contempt. This isn't over, he called out as they reached the door. Not by a long shot. Judge Wallace simply adjusted her glasses. Court is in recess until tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. The gavel fell with finality. As Bessent disappeared through the doorway, the gallery erupted in hushed conversations. Reporters rushed for the exits, phones already pressed to their ears. At the prosecution table, Chen gathered her papers, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. Reynolds stepped down from the witness stand, nodding slightly to her as he passed. Did you really have those recordings all along? She asked quietly. A small smile crossed his face. Bessent always said leverage was everything in business. Turns out it works in justice too. Outside the courtroom, a media frenzy was already forming. The headline was writing itself. Wall Street titan Scott Bessent, whose contempt for the law was matched only by his contempt for the court, had finally encountered something his billions couldn't buy. a judge who couldn't be intimidated. As Judge Wallace returned to her chambers, she removed her robe and hung it carefully. There would be pressure, phone calls from powerful people, veiled threats to her career, perhaps even concerns for her safety. But Catherine Wallace had faced pressure before. She glanced at the small framed photo on her desk. Her father, who had lost everything in the financial crash of 2008, a victim of the very kind of financial manipulation Bessent had perfected. "No one is above the law," she murmured to the empty room. "Not even Scott Bessent." In the holding cell below the courthouse, Bessent sat on a metal bench, his Italian suit now wrinkled, his manicured hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. For the first time in decades, he found himself in a situation that money couldn't fix, facing a judge who saw him not as a financial genius or a powerful billionaire, but simply as a man who had finally run out of places to hide. For Scott Bessent, the reckoning had only just begun.